Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you are struggling with everything you thought you knew? Imagine being at a crossroads where your fears, doubts, and inner battles collide, and all you have is your faith. This isn't just a hypothetical scenario, though. It's the story of Jacob, a man whose life was defined by struggle, deception, and the constant pursuit of blessings. Yet, one night, Jacob faced a struggle unlike any he had ever known, a wrestling match with none other than God himself. This moment would not only change his life forever but also serve as a profound lesson for generations to come. Jacob's story is not one of flawless virtue. Far from it. He was born a twin, and even before entering the world, he grasped at his brother Esau's heel, symbolizing a life that would be marked by rivalry and competition. From the very beginning, Jacob's life was one of striving, not just with others but with himself, with his destiny, and ultimately, with God. In the struggle for his father's blessing, Jacob deceived his blind father, stole Esau's birthright, and fled, leaving behind a trail of broken relationships and shattered trust. But as we see in the Bible, Jacob's path was not one of constant failure. Despite his flaws and mistakes, he was chosen for a divine purpose. And one night, by the river Jabbok, everything changed. Before we dive deeper into the spiritual depth of Jacob's wrestling match with God, I want to take a moment to ask you to subscribe to our channel. We'll be exploring more stories like this one, stories that connect deeply with the human experience and teach timeless lessons that resonate in our own lives. So, if you want to learn about powerful biblical moments, click that subscribe button, because you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's continue. Image prompt, a peaceful but lonely landscape at dusk, symbolizing the moment of Jacob's isolation before the encounter. Jacob was on his way home after years of exile. He was returning to the land of his ancestors, but his journey was fraught with fear. Jacob had to face the brother he had wronged, and the tension was unbearable. He feared Esau's wrath. The night before their meeting, Jacob sent his family and possessions ahead, choosing to remain behind alone. It was in this vulnerable moment that something extraordinary occurred. As darkness settled around him, a man, a mysterious figure, appeared and began to wrestle with him. The Bible doesn't shy away from the intensity of this encounter. It tells us that Jacob wrestled with this man until daybreak. What was the significance of this struggle? Why would God choose to engage in such a physical confrontation? And what does this event teach us today about our relationship with God and the struggles we face in our own lives? This moment in Jacob's life is far more than just a physical battle. It's a spiritual one, a moment where Jacob confronts not only his fears but his entire identity. Jacob's life had been built on deception and self-reliance, but this night, everything would change. Jacob found himself face to face with something far greater than himself. The fight was not just about a blessing or an inheritance, it was about transformation. God could have ended the fight in an instant. But instead, he engaged with Jacob, allowing him to wrestle until dawn. In this struggle, Jacob was forced to confront his inner weaknesses, his flaws, and his desperate need for God's blessing. As the fight continued, Jacob held on, determined not to let go until he received a blessing. And at this pivotal moment, God asked Jacob, "What is your name?" This question was more than just a formality. It was a moment of reckoning. Jacob, who had spent his life deceiving others and running from his past, finally admitted his identity. "Jacob," he said, meaning the deceiver. But this moment of honesty led to a transformation. God responded by changing his name to Israel, he who struggles with God. This name change wasn't just symbolic. It was the beginning of Jacob's transformation. No longer defined by his past mistakes, Jacob was now marked by a new identity, one that reflected a deeper relationship with God. The story of Jacob wrestling with God isn't just an ancient narrative. It's a story that speaks directly to us today. How often do we struggle with our own identity, our past mistakes, and our fears? How many of us wrestle with God in times of pain and uncertainty, not knowing how the struggle will end? Yet, just as God transformed Jacob's life that night, he offers us the same opportunity, to struggle with him, to confront our fears and weaknesses, and to come out on the other side transformed. The struggle that Jacob endured that night by the river was far more than a physical altercation. It was a spiritual reckoning, a moment where his entire life was turned upside down and redefined. When God changed Jacob's name to Israel, it was not merely a symbolic gesture. This was a profound moment of transformation. Jacob, the deceiver, the trickster, the one who relied on his own cunning to get by, was now Israel, the one who struggles with God and prevails. This change in identity wasn't just about a name. It signified a new purpose, a new direction for Jacob's life. The physical injury Jacob sustained during the match, a dislocated hip, would be a permanent reminder of the night that changed everything. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, but that limp would also be a symbol of his struggle with God. It would remind him that, through his brokenness and vulnerability, he found blessing. It's important to note that God didn't remove Jacob's weakness. Instead, he worked through it. Jacob's physical disability became a constant reminder that God's strength is made perfect in weakness, and that our struggles, while painful, often lead to the greatest blessings. This transformation is not limited to Jacob alone. It speaks to all of us. How many times do we run from our struggles, afraid of the pain and discomfort that come with facing our weaknesses? Jacob's story shows us that sometimes the most profound spiritual growth happens when we face the very things we fear. God didn't ask Jacob to be perfect. He asked him to wrestle, to confront his fears and his past, and in doing so, to allow God to work through him. The process wasn't easy, and it was marked by physical and emotional pain. But in the end, it led to something beautiful, a new identity, a new relationship with God, and a new future. Jacob's new identity as Israel marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. This new name carried with it a sense of mission, purpose, and divine favor. It was a reminder that no matter how broken or flawed we may be, God sees potential in us. He sees beyond our failures and offers us the opportunity to be transformed. The name Israel would go on to represent a people, the descendants of Jacob, who would struggle, wrestle, and ultimately prevail through their relationship with God. Jacob's story teaches us that wrestling with God is not a sign of weakness, but rather a sign of deep faith and trust. Jacob could have walked away at any point, but he chose to cling to God in his vulnerability and pain. In our lives, we too face moments when we wrestle with God, when we question his plans, his timing, or his presence in our struggles. These are not moments of failure, but opportunities for growth. Just like Jacob, we are called to hold on, to persevere, and to trust that God's blessings are worth the fight. It's important to understand that wrestling with God doesn't mean fighting against him. Instead, it's a process of aligning our will with his, even when it's difficult. Jacob didn't win the fight through his own strength or cunning. He won by refusing to let go, by holding on to God until the very end. This is a powerful lesson for us. In times of doubt and struggle, we are not called to let go of our faith, but to hold on tighter, to trust that God will bring us through. When Jacob held on to God through the night, he wasn't just seeking a blessing for himself. He was also demonstrating a deeper understanding of God's nature. God didn't force Jacob to let go. Instead, he allowed Jacob to wrestle, to struggle, and to work through his doubts and fears. And when Jacob finally surrendered, when he admitted who he truly was, God blessed him. This is a reminder for all of us. Sometimes the greatest blessings come not when we give up, but when we refuse to let go. After the wrestling match, Jacob was not the same man who had entered the night. He had been given a new name, a new identity, and a new sense of purpose. But that new identity didn't come without its challenges. Jacob would still face struggles, both internal and external. He would still have to face his brother Esau, and he would still wrestle with the tension between his past mistakes and his newfound faith. But now he had the strength to face those challenges differently. He no longer had to rely on his own deceit and manipulation. He could trust in God's plan, and that trust would guide him through the remainder of his journey. For us, embracing our new identity in Christ doesn't mean that life will be easy. We will still face struggles, but we will approach them with the assurance that we are not alone. Just like Jacob, we can hold on to God through the struggles, knowing that he is working in and through us to bring about his purposes. After the night of wrestling, Jacob, now Israel, did not suddenly become immune to struggle. In fact, his life continued to be full of challenges. But something had shifted in him. The man who once relied on cunning, manipulation, and deceit now had a new foundation, his faith in God. Israel's transformation wasn't just about a change in name. It was about embracing a new identity that would define his path moving forward. The struggles he would face from this moment on weren't meant to break him, but rather to refine him. Israel still had to face his brother Esau, who was initially angry at him for stealing the blessing. But instead of running away or trying to control the situation through manipulation, Israel approached his brother with humility, asking for forgiveness. This was a profound change from the man who had once tricked his father and brother for his own gain. His transformation was visible in his actions. His willingness to approach Esau with honesty and humility reflected the new man he had become, a man marked not by his deceit, but by his encounter with God. This moment of reconciliation with Esau is significant because it marks the beginning of Israel's new life. He no longer had to live in fear of others, nor did he need to manipulate circumstances to achieve his goals. Instead, he could trust in God's plan and walk forward with the confidence that God was guiding him. This is an important lesson for all of us. Our struggles, no matter how painful, can lead to transformation. But it requires humility, honesty, and a willingness to rely on God rather than our own strength. Jacob's transformation into Israel was not just a personal change. It had far-reaching consequences. God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was passed down to Israel's descendants, the 12 tribes of Israel. These tribes would go on to form a great nation, one that would struggle and wrestle with God throughout its history, but one that would also experience God's faithfulness in profound ways. Israel's descendants would be marked by both their struggles and their triumphs. Throughout the Bible, we see the story of the Israelites as a microcosm of the human experience, a people who wrestle with God, face difficult circumstances, and are often disobedient, but who are also deeply loved and redeemed by God. The story of Israel is a story of God's unwavering faithfulness, even when his people struggle. Just as Jacob's personal encounter with God led to transformation, the nation of Israel would experience transformation through its relationship with God. For us today, the legacy of Israel reminds us that God's promises are not just for one individual, but for generations to come. When we wrestle with God and experience his transformation in our lives, the impact is not limited to ourselves. Just as Jacob's transformation led to the birth of a nation, our transformation can have a ripple effect, impacting our families, our communities, and even future generations. The lessons we learn in our struggles are not just for our own growth, but also for the blessing of those around us. As we embrace our identity in Christ and trust in God's guidance, we can pass on the legacy of faith and transformation to others. Our struggles can become the foundation for a future marked by hope, redemption, and the faithfulness of God. One of the key takeaways from Jacob's story is the role that struggle plays in spiritual growth. It's easy to assume that our faith should be free of challenges and hardships, but the reality is that spiritual growth often comes through struggle. Jacob's wrestling match with God was a literal and figurative fight. It wasn't just about overcoming an external opponent. It was about facing his own internal struggles, his fear, his guilt, and his need for control. In many ways, we are all like Jacob. We struggle with God, with our past, and with our weaknesses. But it is in these struggles that we find our greatest growth. Just as Jacob was transformed through his wrestling match, so too can we be transformed when we face our own battles head-on. The Bible tells us that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness, 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9. It is often in the midst of our struggles that we experience God's grace in the most profound ways. Jacob's experience teaches us that when we struggle with God, when we bring our doubts, our fears, and our weaknesses before him, we open the door for transformation. The struggle itself becomes an opportunity for God to work in us and through us. It is not a sign of failure, but a sign of God's grace, as he shapes us into the people he has called us to be. At the end of the night, Jacob was blessed, but it wasn't just the physical blessing that mattered. It was the spiritual blessing that would last forever, a blessing that would transform not only his life, but the lives of all who would come after him. God's faithfulness was evident in his willingness to meet Jacob in his struggle and to bless him, despite his imperfections. This is the ultimate blessing, God's presence in our lives, even in the midst of our struggles. Just as God met Jacob by the river Jabbok, he meets us in our struggles. He doesn't abandon us or leave us to fight alone. Instead, he walks with us, offering us the strength to endure and the grace to be transformed. The story of Jacob wrestling with God is not just a story of personal transformation. It is a story of God's faithfulness to his people. It shows us that no matter how deeply we struggle or how far we fall, God is always there, ready to meet us where we are and to offer us his blessing. As we face our own battles in life, whether they be internal struggles, relational challenges, or spiritual doubts, let us remember that God is with us, working in and through us to bring about his purposes. The wrestling match is not a sign of failure, but a sign of God's love and faithfulness. So let us hold on to God, knowing that through our struggles, we too will be transformed.